All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. And I'd like to start out by introducing Mayor Steve Moss of the City of Grandville to give a welcome.
Good morning. What a beautiful day. It's always beautiful in Grandville, but it's even better when there's a little blue sky and a little fall in the air. So glad that you were here, and what a fun celebration, right? I know not a lot about Rosie the Riveter. I know the iconic picture, but not a lot about their history. And I see we have a couple Rosies here, yes, or their offspring or whatever. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about Rosie the Riveter. So right now, I'd like to introduce State Chaplain, former National Chaplain for the American Legion, Larry Volink. Thanks.
Let's pray to God, thank Him for a beautiful day, and thank Him for this time and gathering we have here today. Let's bow in prayer. Dear God, as we look to you and look up to you, knowing that you are a part of this celebration as well, that you are a part of what happened in the past, what happened in the times when these women were able to take the initiative to do the things that are necessary to bring peace to the world many years ago. I'm thankful that I was able to be a part of that many years ago through my class. South High School was able to be involved in being able to purchase a bomber many years ago, and they're able to remember what happened back in World War II, how they were able to participate as well. The whole country working together to bring peace in this world, and just a little part of Rosie able to do this and say, we can do it. That initiative was able to be the driving force through this country many years ago. We're thankful that we had a president from Grand Rapids that was able to initiate our freedom many years ago, Gerald Ford, who was able to be a part of our national bring efforts to bring peace to this world. And today, we also ask for those troops that are serving our country many places, and those who might even have children or young people that are serving in our country. We pray for them too. We all thank you for this beautiful day, the time when we can be able to see the beauty of a rose and the planting of these roses to bring memory to the times of what happened years ago. And we thank you for the ones that are here this day. Continue to bless beautiful day. Help us to learn some wonderful things that will inspire us today, that we too can say the words, we can do it. And so, as we're here today, we pray that your blessings will be here today. Amen. Amen. Oops. Uh-oh. Okay.
Thank you, Chaplain. I'd also like to introduce Commander Asus Sanabria from the American Legion Fonger Post to give the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please place the flag, which you're already doing. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Thank you all for coming today. It's not going to rain on us.
Thank you, Commander. Our first speakers will be Sue Potter and Jenna Wilmers from the American Legion Fonger Post to talk a little bit about Rosie the Riveter and some of the history behind Rosie. So I'll invite them to come up. They've also created some storyboards to show some pictures to tell the story as well.
Good morning. You're going to suffer through a fifth grade teacher, okay? So get ready. I've retired one, but I loved it. Okay, naturally we have storyboards, and I have my pointer.
If they stay out,
Rosie the Riveter was the most successful recruiting activity in American history. We had 16 million people, women in the workforce in 1940, but in 1941, when we got attacked by Pearl Harbor, 2 million women had to come up and step up and take the place in the workforce for the men who fought. Now, how do you get these women to do this? Well, they use posters. If you can do a beater, you can do a drill. If you can do a sewing machine, you can do a riveter. So they started to recruit women. We didn't have TV, we only had radio, posters, and we had books and everything. So in 1942, Westinghouse, William Powell was his name, he made this poster, and the poster was only up for 2 weeks. And it was in the factory, and then was put away. Then we had two men who wrote a song called Rosie the Riveter. I'm going to try to play it for you. Here we go. I know, here we go. Whoops. Can't get on my phone. Rosie the Riveter.
you don't
No,
know.
I know.
And I don't know how to do it.
Okay, well, then I'm gonna go ahead. We'll get her. Hang on. Well, the men who wrote the song Rosie the Riveter looked at it. They saw a riveter at a factory in California, and they looked at her and said, "Boy, she's good looking. We're gonna write a song about her." And her name was Rosalind, so they called her Rosie the Riveter.
Oh, yeah, it's ready.
Okay, and here's the song.
Get play that one.
Yep.
All the day long with the rain or shine, she's aboard of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory.
You can hear it?
Rosie, the riveter,
I could never do that.
Look up for sabotage, sitting up there on the fuselage. That little friend can do more than a man can do. Rosie, the riveter, Rosie got a boyfriend, Charlie. Charlie, he's a Marine. Rosie is protecting Charlie, working overtime on the riveting machine. When they gave her a production need, she was as proud as a girl could be. There's something true about red, white, and blue about Rosie, the riveter.
Good dancing song.
Rosie, the riveter. Rosie, 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 working on the assembly line. Rosie, 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 the riveter, on the assembly line.
Thank you, Rosie. Okay. And that was a really, really popular song. And then we have Norman Rockwell, a very, very famous artist for the Saturday Evening Post. And they had him draw a picture of Rosie the Riveter. He based it on the song. And let me show you the picture. Which one? Which is the largest one? This one? Yeah. This one right here. Okay, this is the one. This picture right here, he drew the picture of Rosie the Riveter. And he got a dental assistant from Vermont to sit for him just for the face. Now, what did he use for that muscular body? he used one of Michelangelo's pictures on the Sistine Chapel from the prophet Isaiah. And you can see where the bodies are very similar. But we wanted her to look tough because the Germans thought we were weak because of our depression pictures. We had to be tough. So he used the body of Isaiah and the face of the little dental assistant. Later in life, she said she was a little upset about having her head on the body of the prophet, but it worked out okay. So this was the most popular picture of Rosie, by far. Remember, the one that We Can Do It was put away after 2 weeks and not brought out again until the 1970s. There were about 35,000 gals named Rosie during this time in our history. So because of this, and all these gals working in the factories, we crossed the culture line, the job line, and women can do the same. Before the war, only like 37% of all jobs were open to women. After the war, 85% were open because they proved they could do it. And we have some other pictures of Rosies who were very popular. There was a Rose in the plant in New York City, in New York, and she won a riveting contest. Rosie the Riveter, okay? And then the most famous Rosie, though, was from Michigan. And her name was Rockwell. And her picture is... Where's Rose? Right here. Roswell Monroe. She was at the Ypsilanti plant. Ypsilanti, okay? There was a 33 million square foot Ford plant that was converted to make airplanes. And Walter Pidgeon, a famous actor at that time, was walking through the factory and happened to see her and met her. And she was the star of all kinds of documentaries during that time. After the war, she became a pilot herself. She had a small crash, but then she lived quite to, I think, age 76 or 78. She was probably the most famous one. And then but after the war, all these women came to work. They said, you've got to work, bring your husbands home, you've got to work, you've got to work. But after the war, they said, no, go home. Go home to your housework, and have babies and all that. But it did change the world. Rosie's changed the world because they empowered women to say, yeah, we can do these things. Now, in the 1970s, when the women's movement came through, they could not get the copyright for Norman Rockwell's picture. They couldn't do it. So they started looking for other pictures, and they found the one from the Westinghouse Company that was only up for 2 weeks. And that's the one that's the most popular one of all. I just thought that was really interesting. But we thank Rosies, all the Rosies who made way for all the women today. Remember, the people who worked there only made half the amount of money of the men doing the same job, except for the ones at Ypsilanti. They were paid the same. I thought that was pretty cool, all right? Michigan led the way there, too. Okay, but we thank Rosie, and we thank everyone here today. Thank you. Want to add anything? Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one thing. My mother was 16 years old in 1941. She joined the Waves. 350,000 young women joined the Women's Emergency Service thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt. She was stationed in Washington, D.C., and marched in FDR's funeral. I thought that was cool. My grandmother had her victory gardens, and part of her ration book is on one of the posters, too. They had to have rations after the war, too. Not only during the war, but after the war. And my mother and dad got married, and they didn't have any silk for a gown. But my dad got a hold of some friends, he was in the Air Force, and they got the material from parachute, silk, and her dress was made from a parachute. So that's pretty cool. But thank you.
Thank you, Sue and Jenna, for the history lesson and for putting together these great storyboards. We'll leave them up here for people to take a look at a little closer at the end of the ceremony. So my name is Josh Meringa. I'm on the Grandville City Council. I'm also on the Grandville Park and Recs Board. And as part of this dedication, we were looking for some local stories that we could share with you about Rosies from this area. And I had a couple people that were able to reach out to me and share the connections that they had with Rosies and their families. So I'd like to highlight their stories as representative of the many Rosies with connections to Grandville and across West Michigan whose memory we're honoring today at the dedication of this Rose Garden. So the first is the mother of local resident Diane Troost. Diane wasn't able to be here today, but she shared with me that her mother, whose name was Mary Jane Bosman, was born and raised in the Grand Rapids area. Prior to the war, Mary Jane married Diane's father, Harold, and they had 2 daughters. Harold worked for the C&O Railroad before the war, and Mary Jane stayed home and raised their daughters. When Harold was drafted into the Army during the war, Mary Jane went to work in the General Motors plant on 36th Street in Wyoming, that was then known as Fisher Body, Grand Rapids, where she worked as a Rosie for war purposes, and she made shells for artillery. During World War II, Fisher Body had the signature product of the 120 millimeter M1 anti-aircraft gun. That was kind of their main signature product that they made. They also made components and assemblies for several types of aircraft, including the B-25s and the B-29 airplanes, as well as tanks, naval breech gun housings, machine guns, gun parts, loaders, and rammers, along with 150 millimeter artillery shells. Harold was in the Philippine Islands working as an engineer on the supply chain, bringing the shells to the front lines. After the war, Harold resumed working for the C&O Railroad. Harold and Mary Jane built a house in the 1950s in the Grandville area and continued to raise their family with 3 girls. Most of the extended family remains in the area. So Diane says, "Thank you for honoring my mom and all the many other ladies who stood alongside their men and served. She would be proud." There were several manufacturing companies in the area that made products to support the war effort, employing local Rosies, including the McInnery Spring and Wire Company in Grand Rapids, which produced parachutes and flare guns, and this was actually one of the first factories in this area to employ women during the war. In Granville, we had the Winters and Crampton Furniture Factory that's on Wilson, now the Granville Center, that was converted to support the war effort as well and employed many women also. I had another resident or local woman who reached out to me, Nicole Avlasuk. Is Nicole here today? Hi, Nicole. Nicole reached out and actually shared her grandmother's story with me. She shared a college term paper that she wrote highlighting the legacy of the women of World War II, including her grandmother's story. And I connected with her beforehand, and she gave me permission to share some of it with you. So I'm going to share Nicole's words as she writes about her grandmother, if that's okay. So she writes, "The sacrifices and triumphs shared by Rosie the Riveter are embedded in my grandmother's identity, which has influenced my character, my choices, and my life. Millions of women across the country answered the government's call to head off to the factories in order to build the airplanes, armored tanks, and weaponry needed by the Allied forces to fight Germany and Japan. Patriotic posters were prevalent in thousands of businesses and radio advertisements, reaching homes across the U.S. constantly. Advertisements mobilizing home front wives by proclaiming, 'Longing won't get him back sooner, get a war job,' and 'We can do it,' and prominent magazines such as the Saturday Evening Post featured Rosie the Riveter on its cover in May of 1943 to encourage more women to enter the workforce and applaud those already holding war jobs. Just as her fellow Americans were heading to the factories, my grandmother, Nicole's grandmother, Maxine Smith, answered the call. She was working in a small clothing factory when the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, and after a visit from her sister Dutch and the influence of her sister-in-law Ruthie, she decided to apply for work in a factory. However, Maxine faced discrimination when she attempted to work in the factories. She applied and she was faced with the problem of citizenship because she was born in Canada. With the extreme paranoia sweeping across the country, applying to be a factory worker became a difficult process for her if she was an applicant that was born abroad. Maxine was forced to prove her citizenship to gain her job, and in order to substantiate her citizenship, she needed to prove her father's citizenship, which in turn would prove her own. She had to prove that her father was drafted during World War II or had been eligible for the draft during World War I, which would prove that she was an American citizen because he was capable of being drafted. Once the request was received, Maxine filled out additional paperwork in order to gain her father's official records authorizing his military service, which was deferred because at the time he was living with his family in Canada. So once Maxine gained official documentation, she applied and finally gained a job at Woodall Industries in the summer of 1942 and began manufacturing B-29 bomber doors for the Martin Aircraft Company. She attended training in order to learn the process of riveting and began working 5 10-hour days weekly. Her perseverance was rewarded when she brought home a $75 check each week, often more than her grandfather was making while dispatching for the Interstate Trunk Company near Detroit. Nicole's grandmother joined the emergency female workforce that America needed to win the war. And she says, as Joseph Stalin told Franklin Roosevelt, we all know Detroit is winning the war, and my grandmother was doing her part. The new niche that my grandmother and other working American women carved for themselves in the working society changed the role for women in the U.S. until the end of the war. Even though most American women would give up their jobs to the soldiers returning home after 1945, they were no longer seen as the fragile sex that was only capable of running a household and raising children. Women were popping rivets into airplanes and building the machines needed to win the war, all while raising their families without their husbands. The achievements of American women to enter the previously male-dominated workforce was felt by each individual woman that turned in her skirt for a pair of overalls. In my grandmother's case, Nicole writes, her triumph was seen at the very start of her career with the issue of her training records, which was given to assist the bearer in finding a position either in private employment or military service for which he is best fitted. The first indication of her achievement was immediately evident when the certification was standardized as though she were a man. The stigma of earlier generations regarding women no longer applied when America was faced with the reality of war. So one of the motivations for the women of America to find a war job was the government's campaign to promote positive accomplishments of the war. During the summer of 1943, the famous B-17 bomber Memphis Belle began a promotional tour in order to show the World War II factory workers what their hard work was accomplishing. Nicole's grandmother attended the tour ceremony, and she, along with all of her colleagues, were able to see what their work was producing and could accomplish. The Memphis Belle symbolized dramatic victories the U.S. was winning against both Germany and Japan. Upon the Memphis Belle's arrival in Detroit in 1943, it had successfully completed 25 missions. The Tour of the Belle was a prime example of the emphasis the U.S. government placed on morale. Nicole continues, the innocence that America lost following the attack on Pearl Harbor and throughout the war years was felt everywhere and impacted the generation of the 1940s forever. That impact was left on my grandmother and has passed on to me. Her dedication to her work and her country has helped me to appreciate her more and has made me to be as motivated in my work and inspired in my life. Her strength to leave her 2 young sons and work 10-hour shifts during one of the most difficult times in America's history has made me appreciate the difficulty and sacrifice and appreciate what the World War II generation has to the country that we have today. The women of the 1940s were not only aided in the success of World War II and the improved portrait of the American woman, but also gained a sense of accomplishment themselves from their husbands and from a grateful nation. Women discovered that they could in fact raise families, support their country, and have a career, all with or without their husbands for several months or even years. The same pride is echoed in Nicole's family. She writes, upon interviewing my grandmother for the paper that she wrote, her entire demeanor exuded the pride she still held because of her role helping the country win the Great War. It was a long trip for, as she told me, each morning your grandfather would drive me to the factory on his way to work. It was a long trip for Russell, her grandfather, to take, and she was almost late for work almost every morning. But one of the men of the factory will hold the door for her, and another held her time card so she could punch in and not be late. Your grandfather would be very proud that I went to work, and I was proud of myself too, she writes. However, even with the pride that my grandmother and other female workers held, concerns still did exist that the people of the United States during World War II, their lives were filled with good times and bad, as her grandmother told her. Her grandparents in all Detroit shaded their windows at night in order to hinder Japanese or German bombing raids. The people of America lived in fear, and their loss of innocence could not be totally healed by the intense state of patriotism that embraced the entire country. As Nicole's grandmother worked in the Woodall factory, she watched her fellow workers struggle and yet continue to produce the needed machinery for the war. Even her grandmother experienced the extra push to gain a war job and keep it when during her training she was told to stick to it by a friend of James Doolittle who had led the raid on Japan to avenge Pearl Harbor. The helplessness sweeping the nation on December 7th was healed but for many women when her grandmother and other American women were able to go to work and encouraged Maxine to receive added to her persistence to help her country. She continues, the repression of independence that many women gained during World War II led to the domestic roles of women during the 1950s and 1960s. America entered an age of continued economic and technological prosperity, and when the war was over, again took a secondary role to men in the workforce. My grandmother lived the reality of being repressed following her service as a defense worker. Once the war ended, my grandfather was transferred to Grand Rapids to run the interstate trucking branch. Her grandmother returned home to care for her 2 sons, Don and Dennis, and continue having her family. The perception of American women and their place in society was mobilized at the outbreak of the war, and women emerged from the kitchen and was halted again at the end of the war when they re-entered their homes. At the end of my grandmother's riveting career, she had a small space of time before the war ended when she and her family were in Grand Rapids for her grandfather's new job. Her grandmother found a new part-time job that would also coincide with her duties at home. In 1944, the United States Air Force established an army of 1.5 million civilians in the Ground Observer Corps to patrol the skies of the United States against possible Japanese or German attacks. Nicole's grandmother joined the Grand Rapids chapter of the GOC with her friend and observed a spot overlooking the city in order to protect the U.S. The other GOC members patrolled 14,000 posts across the U.S., mainly on the west and east coasts. However, several were established to observe the Great Lakes in Michigan because of the large role Detroit played in the War of Manufacturing. Nicole's grandmother's influence, she writes, on my life has stemmed from her personal strength and determination and has taken on an even greater meaning since the terrorist attacks of the World Trade Towers, the Pentagon in Pennsylvania, on September 11th. The shock of Pearl Harbor on my grandmother's generation has been repeated with the effect of September 11 on her generation. In the face of danger, she writes, my grandmother and the people of the 1940s triumphed, and I hope at least a small portion of her immeasurable strength has been passed on to me. Her character molded who her children became, and for me, her influence has been greatly passed on through my father and mother. She talks about passing this on to her children and looks forward to telling them about their great-grandmother, who she calls an unknown warrior of World War II. Thank you so much, Nicole, for sharing your paper and your story about your grandmother. It's very meaningful and really highlights, as an example, what we're trying to do today in honoring women in their service. So Maxine and Mary Jane's stories really highlight the important contributions of so many women made during the war effort, and they really exemplify the reasons we're here today to commemorate their service through the establishment of this garden. So thank you again for sharing the story. I would now like to introduce Matt Cohen, who's the District Director for Congressman Bill Huizenga's office, to make a few remarks.
Well, good morning, and thanks for having us here. Unfortunately, Congressman Huizenga is in Washington, couldn't make it, so he sent me in his place. But wanted to let you know about a initiative that's going on in Washington that has to do with Rosie the Riveter. Bill sits on the Financial Services Committee, and one of the subcommittees, Monetary Policy, gets to do these cool things called Congressional Gold Medals. They are made to remember certain individuals and groups. We are in the process of doing a Congressional Gold Medal for Rosie the Riveter. What that means is a medal will be presented collectively to the women in the United States who joined the workforce during World War II, providing the vehicles, weaponry, and ammunition to win the war, that were referred to as Rosie the Riveter, in recognition of their contributions to the United States and the inspiration they have provided to the ensuing generations. It's H.R. 1773. Congressman Huizenga and 10 other members from the state of Michigan are co-sponsors, as well as hundreds from around the country. It's sitting in committee right now, but we're hopeful it'll move forward. It directs the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem of the Senate to appropriate arrangements for the award a single Congressional Gold Medal to Rosie the Riveter. Medal shall be displayed in the National Museum of American History. Make the medal available to display at other locations associated with Rosie the Riveter. These Congressional Gold Medals don't happen just for anybody or for anything. Bill actually was able to award one of his family members a Congressional Gold Medal recently this year, who flew in the Civil Air Patrol. Another group that performed duties in the same time and actually protected the Sioux Locks up north to make sure the iron can make it down into the rest of the country to supply these factories. So that Congressional Gold Medal went through last year, and we're hopeful this one will go through this time with the support of Congressman Huizenga. So, thanks.
Great. Thanks, Matt. I appreciate you being here and representing the Congressman. Our next speaker is Angie Timmon-Morthland, who is a Grandville alumni, currently living in Indiana, but she is kind of the inspiration for getting this garden started. Angie reached out to me a few months ago, or to the city, about setting up this garden, and so Angie really is kind of the inspiration for getting this going. And so I want to invite her up to talk a little bit about the work that she does. She's very involved with the American Rosie the Riveter Association and the Spirit of 45. And I've asked her to share a few words kind of about the organizations that she's part of and her involvement, as well as kind of why these gardens are being set up and what they mean. So, thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the city of Grandville for agreeing to do this. This is amazing. Can everybody get your arm up? Show me you got a Rosie arm. Come on, you guys can do it. On count of three, we're going to yell, "We can do it," because I know we've been up here for a while. Are you ready? Everybody in the back, you know, the cheap seats. You ready? 1, 2, 3. We can do it! Wait. I know we can yeah. One more time. 1, 2, 3. We can do it! That was a lot better. Thank you so much. I am honored to be here And there's a couple reasons why I'm here. One sitting right over there, it's because it's my mom. And two, other women who worked. 11 years ago, I was invited to be a Rosie at a history fest, and it's been going ever since. I'm part of the American Rosie the Riveter Association that started in 1998 in Birmingham, Alabama. Dr. Frances Carter started it. She was a Rosie, and she's still going strong right now. And so I'm part of a group that gets a chance to honor Rosies. And that's one of the reasons why we do it. It's for people like this. They're faces that you don't get to remember. Everybody in the audience, I'm sure, has a legacy that's got a Rosie in it. I'm considered a rosebud. Don't I look pretty? A rosebud is a descendant of a Rosie. So it's someone that had a Rosie in their past. So I had to dig down deep, and my mom was only 7. She says, I don't remember much about the war, but I remember the ration booklets, and I remember that my mama did a lot of laundry and stuff. So I did a little research, and during that time in Grand Rapids, several women were brought in to work as doing laundry for the servicemen and to put their patches and their medals on. And my grandmother probably was one of those. But I can't confirm or deny that, but I'm going to say that's a pretty good thing. Almost every woman during that time stepped up to do something they wouldn't normally do. I'm going to talk a little bit about the gardens real quick. The gardens were part of the Spirit of 45, which is I would say, the U.S. government's initiative to keep the memory of all the World War II events alive. And in 2017, Weeks Roses decided to hybrid a Rosie the Riveter rose, which you see over here. It's specifically meant for Rosie. It's a peach rose with a little bit of spice on the top, kind of like Rosie was. You know, she might be looking hard here, but after work she still looked like a woman. So that's kind of what the rose was for. And then on Rosie the Riveter Day, which is March 21st, it's considered the National Rosie the Riveter Day during Women's History Month. It was planted in Richmond, California at the Rosie the Riveter Historical Park in Richmond, California, and it was amazing. So then they started calling all us Rosies who's doing this, hey, let's try to get one in every single district in every single state by the time 2021 comes around. So when you get a phone call on your phone that says Washington, D.C., you think, oh, I don't know who it is. I didn't answer it for a couple days until they left a message of saying, hey, could you call us back? We really need your help. So I work with the state of Indiana. We were the first in the Midwest down there. Grandville is the first in western Michigan to have a National Rosie the Riveter Garden. I might be a 1980s graduate of Grandville, but I played ball right over there. And I was also the recipient of the American Legion Award my senior year. Two things go together. This was amazing. We reached out and they decided to join with us. So that's how it came about. But I'm going to read you something brief, and then we're going to have some taps. They were Rosies. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, wives, and grandmothers. They were all Rosies. They worked as riveters, buckers, sanders, welders, and crane operators. Seamstress, cooks, bullet makers, you name the job, they did it. They were all Rosies. They came from all over the country. They came from small towns and big towns. They came from Washington to Florida, Michigan to Texas, Maine to California, and even Canada. They were all Rosies. They were teenagers, young adults, and seniors. They came together for one purpose, to help win the war. They made landcraft, they made tanks, they made aircraft, they made millions of munitions. They packed parachutes, they cooked meals, they raised the morale by singing, which I will not do. They were all Rosies. They were more than just women working together. They raised their families together. They cried when their loved ones didn't come back. They worried about anybody else that might be hurt. They were Rosies. After so many years, who will remember all that? Who will remember that they were Rosies? We are the American Rosie the Riveter Association. That's why we're going to remember. That's why we thank and honor them today. Now, I was telling my mom and aunt who were visiting with me why I do this. I have a gold star. Everyone knows what that means. When a fallen soldier doesn't come home, their family gets the gold star. I was given this 7 years ago from a woman that was in a nursing home. And she said, please always remember why we did this. And that's why we remember. So I keep it with me every time I do an event. And that's why we're going to have taps played today. is for those who didn't make it back, and we honor those who are with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. That was Ross Huber from the Grandville High School Band, Assistant Director. I'm going to invite Heather Shadig and the folks from the Chamber to come up. We're going to have a ribbon cutting to officially open our garden, and everyone that's here in attendance is welcome to join us to get in the picture, to be part of the ribbon cutting. So we'll go ahead and do that. That's kind of a tradition that we like to do in Grandville. We have a great Grandville Jenison Chamber here that is very supportive of our community in many different ways. Businesses, organizations, the city, and so we're going to have a ribbon cutting, and we've got Rosie the Riveter ribbon to do it with today. So come on up, Heather.
Okay.
Look, I got big scissors. Okay. Anybody else want to be in the picture?
And they're real.
And they are. I mean,
Do they really work?
yes, they do. Okay, so
Picture real quick first.
look up.
Oh, picture it. I'm gonna get a couple pictures first. Look at Heather. And all the
You do
photographers.
realize
This one a
we're going
minute.
to charge you all for that, right? No propaganda posters.
Oh, 1 second. Wait, hold on a second.
There we go.
Couple more pictures.
Everybody smile,
Stand
right? Where are we
Stand up
looking?
tall so you have no double chins.
Okay, I am ready when you are.
Ready? Countdown.
Guys,
2, 3.
Come on, all the way. Hands up.
We can do it.
That's what I said.
You did it.
Got it. And we got the post in there.